Morning, good morning. I can see a lot of people are joining. We've still got a few coming through. So we'll just do some introductions and give everybody else a couple more moments to log on. So good morning, everybody. We've got an exciting session for you this morning about the Employment Rights Bill. And I'm joined this morning by my colleagues, Gemma Duxbury from the Procurement Information team, Sam Gorrell from our Education Property team, Laura McHugh from our employment team, Catherine Herries, our professional skills lawyer, and helps us to present all of these things, so can take full credit for all the slides rather than anybody else. And I think that's all of us this morning, unless I've missed anybody. I can only see so many of us this morning. I think I've covered everybody. So good morning, everybody. I can see still a couple more people are just joining in. So good morning and welcome. It's good to have so many of you here again. Obviously, all very excited, as much as our employment lawyers about the employment bill. It's what gets us up in the morning, is seeing all the employment law changes coming. And I expect that you're all really excited to know what's happening and what's going on. So what we're going to do is do a bit of a session around that this morning. Obviously, if anybody's got questions, they want to put any comments on, obviously open that up in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that and we will answer your questions, probably more likely towards the end of the session. But do, store those questions up, get them across to us, and then we can obviously have a look at those with you. So, good morning. Just see a few more people have joined. We will get started then. So, Kat, is it? I think it's you first, is it, or is it Laura first?
It's Laura first.
It's me, yeah.
Over to Laura.
Thanks, Ruth. And thanks, everybody. Now, some of you may have been on our last Q&A when we gave a very brief sort of initial reaction to the Employment Rights Bill because it had just been published, I think that maybe the day before or a couple of days before our last Q&A. So what we're going to do today is have a look at a few more things in a little bit more detail and specifically, obviously, focus on the things that may impact the education sector. So if we just move through the slides, I'm just going to first of all talk a little bit about the background and then go on to talk about when we can expect these changes. There is a bit of a spoiler there in the slide that it's not necessarily something that's happening immediately. But just to go back over how we got to this point, as many of you know, so I'll just go over it briefly. Obviously, when Labour won their general election, they did promise whole-scale employment law reforms, and they committed to laying before Parliament this Employment Rights Bill, and they said they were going to do that within 100 days of them coming into office. Now, at the time, that did seem like quite a tight timescale for them to do that and to bring in such what could be significant all-encompassing changes. However, the government did meet this commitment, and on the 10th of October, the Employment Rights Bill was published. There was quite a lot of press around that, as you can imagine. The Department for Business and Trade, they described the reforms which the bill was going to introduce as landmark reforms. And they said the purpose of it essentially was to help deliver economic security and growth to businesses, workers and communities across the UK. So in terms of after the bill was published, the bill then was passed in terms of its first reading with a majority of 281 votes. Not surprising given the composition of the government, but that's where it was at, and that granted employees new rights, or will do when it comes into effect, in relation to a number of things. And there's a slide I'll come on to a bit later, which has, an overview of all the different areas that are changing, but we're talking about potential changes to sick pay, to flexible working, paternity leave. So a number of things. But I will say that the bill, whilst it was met with a positive response from some parties, especially from trade unions, there were some criticisms when the bill was first published. And one particular criticism came from the Shadow Business Secretary, and he warned that it could create a crisis of a magnitude not seen since the pandemic for small businesses. So hopefully not things that would necessarily impact people who are on the webinar today, but just to be aware of the mixed reaction to the bill that we've had so far. And that Shadow Business Secretary, Mr. Hollinrake, he actually said to the Commons when they were discussing the bill, He said, the question I ask myself now is, when this legislation is in place, would I start that small business again today? Sadly, the answer is probably no, certainly not one that employed any people. So that just gives you a flavour that some people are saying that there is quite a burden that's going to be put on employers as a result of the bill. So we will talk about a few of those things. But in terms of the potential cost, the government's impact assessment, when they were putting the bill together, indicated that the reforms could impose direct costs on businesses of around £5 billion annually. But they have, those assessments have indicated that small and micro businesses, as I've said, could be expected to bear quite a disproportionate amount of that burden. And as I mentioned, the trade union community has welcomed the bill. They've had quite a different view on it. They said that the legislation that the bill sets down is good for workers, good for businesses, and good for the wider economy. So in terms of these changes and whether or not they're likely to be imminent, I think it's worth remembering that not all of the reforms which Labour is proposing will require primary legislation. So some of the changes will be able to take place via codes of practice, or just changes to the remit of existing bodies, such as the Low Pay Commission. In terms of the date, I wish we could give you the date, but as the slide says, we don't have a set date for when the employment law reforms will all take place. The bill will need to go through the parliamentary process. It will be scrutinised by MPs and peers, and that could actually result in amendments being made to what is in the current proposals. So the government have said in a document they've put together about the next steps in terms of making work pay, they have confirmed that they expect to begin consultation, which has actually already happened in relation to a few reforms, which I'll come on to. But that some of the key reforms, for example, regarding the right to claim unfair dismissal, they won't take effect until autumn 2026 at the earliest. So what we've got is this situation where employment law changes are likely to happen on a piecemeal basis. What that means is that organisations will have to keep appraised of how this is continually changing, which obviously they will be able to do via Q&As like this. So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned consultation, and what the government have done is that after the bill was published, they've already launched a number of consultations. There are 4 that are currently open. So we've got collective redundancy and fire and rehire. So what the government is asking for thoughts on is whether or not there should be a removal of the current cap on the protective award. So that's an award that can be made, saying that employers have to make an award to employees if there is a failure to follow process when it comes to collective redundancies. So currently that protective award is set at 90 days, so that's the cap. So the consultation is about whether or not that should be removed. And then secondly, whether there should be interim relief available for collective consultation and fire and rehire matters, which essentially would mean that if somebody's bringing a claim in relation to a failure to fairly collectively consult, or they're bringing a claim in relation to what they believe has been an unfair dismissal with a rehire situation, they could, if the consultation leads the government to change this, be a shift in that those people bringing the claims could ask the tribunal at the point in which they lodge a claim or shortly afterwards to be given interim relief until the hearing is actually heard, which can be a payment equivalent to what their salary was. So that can be quite significant for employers in terms of the costs of potential tribunal claims. Another consultation we've got underway is about strengthening statutory sick pay. The changes introduced within the bill will mean that for some lower earners, including those earning below the current lower earnings limit, their rate of statutory sick pay will be calculated as a percentage of their earnings instead of the flat weekly rates. So the consultation seeks views on what this percentage should be and wants to ensure that it provides an earnings replacement when these employees need time off work, which is fair. So that's a second consultation. We've then got one about creating a modern framework for industrial relations, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail shortly. And then we've got one on the application of 0 hours contract measures to agency workers. And that's come about because the government intends to legislate on whether the responsibility for offering workers guaranteed hours should fall to either the employment agency or the end hirer. So I would encourage everybody to get involved with those consultations. They're not open for very long. I think, and Kat can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the end date for those is the 2nd of December. So, they're underway now. They're there for people to have their say. So I would encourage people to go away and have a look at the government website and those links to the consultations so that people can have their opinions put forward on those areas. Okay, and so just an overview. I'm not going to talk about all these in detail because we don't know the exact detail around a lot of these, and we don't know, as we've already said, the dates in which these changes are going to be put in place. But what this slide does demonstrate is just the extent and the breadth of the changes that may well be coming, and we're expecting, unless there's significant changes to the bill. You'll see some on there straight away, I think will be jumping out at you, such as the day one unfair dismissal rights. Very significant, but as I've said, it looks like we've got a 2-year period or around that time before that's going to come in. I did another survey on this recently with a set of employers, and we asked what they thought was the most significant. And we were expecting actually day one rights to be up there, but what came forward was they were still mostly concerned with flexible working at the moment, and the right to switch off came up, and changes to 0 hours contracts. So I think that might be indicative of the fact that they are already aware, or some employers were aware, that the day one rights isn't happening imminently. But as we know, flexible working it is something that is affecting us at the moment. So that seemed to still be the thing that most employers were concerned about at the moment. But there's quite a lot for them to choose from that slide. So we're just going to talk about a few more of those in detail. And firstly, I'm going to touch on the trade union reforms, in particular with minimum service levels first. So you may remember, if we go back to last year, around this time last year, actually on the 28th of November 23, a consultation on implementing minimum service levels in education was launched, and that set out the Conservative government's proposals for minimum service levels in schools and in colleges. It also addressed service levels in universities and sought views on the impact of recent strikes that had been happening, particularly at universities and across the higher education sector. And that consultation closed on the 30th of January. And as a result of that, it was set that those minimum service levels would be going ahead, and that there would be certain levels in different sectors, including education. We've obviously then had the change of government. So Labour have now confirmed that they plan to repeal those minimum service levels that were set down in the Minimum Service Levels Act, so that essentially there won't be the power anymore to make minimum service regulations, which would have allowed employers to give workers or work notices to secure those minimum levels in relation to strike action in particular services. So essentially, this is what the government are now saying they will repeal, and they have said they want to remove the restrictions on the right to strike and to improve industrial relations by giving trade unions the freedom to organise, represent and negotiate on behalf of their workers. And they have said specifically it would remove that power to set those minimum service levels. They refer to those acts that were brought in, or the powers that the Conservative government wanted, as being anti-strike legislation. And obviously this is something that has been welcomed by trade unions, as you can imagine. So in terms of what the reforms look like, we did going into, prior to the bill coming out, expect that there would be quite significant changes in terms of trade union reforms. And I think I would say that that has appeared to materialise, certainly to an extent, because there are quite significant provisions which can be argued to strengthen the rights of trade unions. One of them is that the Employment Rights Bill includes an obligation on employers to give a worker a written statement that the worker has a right to join a trade union, and the bill says that that must be given at the same time as the employer gives the worker their Section 1 or contract of employment statement. We've also got the introduction of access agreements, which will essentially be an agreement between a listed trade union and an employer that provides for access to a workplace by one or more officials of the union for any of the access purposes. That's how it's defined. And those access purposes are set down as to being meeting, representing, recruiting, or organising workers, whether or not those workers are members of a trade union, and to facilitate collective bargaining. But what they don't do is that the access purposes don't extend to organising industrial action itself. And the bill sets down that the employers will have a duty to take reasonable steps to facilitate access and will only be allowed to refuse access entirely where it's reasonable in the circumstances to do so. And the Central Arbitration Committee would be the body that would determine any disputes about that and whether the access has been granted or not. Okay, and some more further reforms that you'll see there on the slide is that the bill talks about getting rid of the requirement to show at the application stage for recognition that at least 50% of workers in the bargaining unit are likely to support recognition. It also grants the Secretary of State a power to reduce the current requirement to show at the application stage that at least 10% of workers in the bargaining unit are members of that union. And they're talking about going down as low as 2%, so it could be somewhere between the 2 and the 10%. And it also includes reforms which will simplify the support required for recognition in the final ballots, so that it would be a simple majority in terms of the voting and the levels that are required for that to be sufficient. And as I said, there is consultation on this. One of the specific things that the government is asking for thoughts on is about the change to the voting requirements. So, if you do have views on that, then, as I say, go to the consultation, have a look at the questions that are coming out from the government on that. Public sector outsourcing, I think Gemma might touch upon the Procurement Act in a bit more detail, so I'll pass over to her when I've finished after my next slide, if that's okay. But just to quickly say around this, the government has talked in the bill about a code of practice to be introduced, which would provide guidance about avoiding essentially a two-tier workforce, which will essentially ensure that employees transferring from the public sector, they maintain their terms and conditions, and any employees supplied by the supplier essentially would be treated the same, therefore avoiding that two-tier workforce. And the code of practice would provide guidance in relation to those relevant outsourcing contracts. Okay, so if I just do my next slide, if that's okay, Kat, I'll just also mention that you may have seen that the bill includes provisions for a school support staff negotiating body to be established. And the bill has said that the remit, as I've said there on the slide, will be for considering the remuneration of school support staff and terms and conditions of their employment. It would also cover training of school support staff and career progression for those people who fall within that remit. The Secretary of State can refer any of those matters to the negotiating body for consideration, or the body can consider a matter within its remit without having to have that referral from the Secretary of State in particular instances. And in terms of who will be covered, school support staff, according to the bill, will mean persons who are employed by a local education authority in England or by a governing body of a school maintained by a local education authority, under a contract of employment providing for the person to work wholly or mainly at one or more schools maintained by a local authority, or employed by essentially an academy under contract of employment. So it specifically won't include qualified school teachers. The bill also sets out some of the processes for reconsideration when the Secretary of State might need to step in to help out about what's being referred to the body and what's being considered and what isn't, and about the constitution of the body, its memberships and proceedings. So we're awaiting that further documentation. We also expect that terms agreed might have retrospective effect, apart from where those terms could affect lower pay for staff or would have a detrimental impact on those terms and conditions of the people within the remit of the body. Okay, so that's my slide done. I'm going to hand over. Gemma, do you want to say anything about the Procurement Act just while we touch on it before we go back to Kat?
Yeah, I've not received any notifications as such with regards to amendment of the Procurement Act, but that could be because obviously I'm not sort of focusing more on the employment side, Laura. So that may well be coming about, or it may be just being more specifically referred to in relation to specific clauses. So we will wait with bated breath to see how that will come about, whether it's an amendment or whether it's guidance, or whether it can be classed as to fall under something that's already there or that's perhaps expanded. And just as a flag though, with the Procurement Act, it was due to come in at the end of October. It's now been pushed back to, I think it's the 24th or 25th of February 2025. So we've still got a few months yet. I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest though, Laura, after what you've just said, if they are going to be making any sort of amendments or anything, it'll get pushed back again. So we'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, we will obviously keep you updated. But at the moment, I've not had any notifications with regards to actual amendments of the Act.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Gemma. So I'll just carry on with some amendments that are contained within the Employment Rights Bill. Now, you might be quite shocked to see us talking about sexual harassment here, because we've done a previous session on the duty that's going to be imposed upon organisations to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And that did come into force on the 26th of October. So that obligation is now in place. But I was quite surprised when I was reading the Employment Rights Bill to see that it says within there that there will be an obligation on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And the reason why I was quite surprised was because previously the Worker Protection Act, as it was when it was going through Parliament, said, look, employers are going to have to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. And he went to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords said, well, that's far too onerous on organisations. How can you take all reasonable steps? That's too much. So they got the red pen out and they struck out the word all. And they said, actually, we're happy with an employer having to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. We think that's a good kind of halfway house. And within the original Worker Protection Act as well, it said, and this obligation will also apply to third-party harassment as well. And the House of Lords again said, no. How on earth can you run an organisation where you've got to think about third-party harassment too? We've tried it before, it didn't work. That's going out too. So the act that came in on the 26th of October just says that you've got to take this preventative duty as an employer to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. It may cover third-party harassment. The Equality and Human Rights Commission feel like it does, but it's not explicitly contained within the Act. We got the Employment Rights Bill, and basically we've gone full circle, and they've reinserted the word all into reasonable steps. And then they've also reinserted the obligation on employers to prevent sexual harassment by third parties, and also harassment generally by third parties as well. Now, this has got to go through the parliamentary process, as Laura said. So it may be that when it goes back in front of the House of Lords, they kind of say, well, we've been here and we've done this. We are concerned about it. But Labour did put this as part of one of their manifesto commitments, that they were going to kind of increase the obligations on employers to do this. So it may very well be that this is kind of one of their non-negotiables. So we'll have to kind of see what happens. But I thought it was just worth remembering at this stage that there is this duty that's now law, where employers do have to take these reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So we have put together at Forbes some assistance for our education clients, whereby we can help you draft sexual harassment policy, a specific one for your organisation. We can help you look at where you might have HR hotspots, where there may be a risk of sexual harassment, particularly, by third parties, parents evenings, things like that. Are you thinking about how you can prevent that happening? So we can think about putting together some kind of checklist with you, some kind of audit. And we've also been asked to do quite a lot of training on this as well. Just so in your organisation, people are aware of what is not acceptable behaviour in an organisation. So we can certainly help people with that. But like I said, the law is in place at present, but the Labour government through the Employment Rights Bill are kind of saying that they want to kind of make it stronger, and there would be this requirement to take these all reasonable steps. So we've gone full circle on that. Looking at flexible working, like Laura said, it's something that a lot of organisations are asking us questions about. And I think it's because prior to the Employment Rights Bill coming into force, Labour, like I said, produced their manifesto, which kind of said, look, we want flexible working to be the default. And we may have seen quite a lot of newspaper articles. I remember a headline in The Guardian which kind of said, you know, everyone's going to be able to work for a 4-day working week, everybody. Everyone can request that, that's absolutely fine. And I was pretty convinced that when we saw the Employment Rights Bill, the 8 reasons that as an employer you can use to say, look, we can't accommodate a flexible working because of, you know, needs of the customers and workflows, etc. I thought they were going to go and it was going to be effective. You have to accommodate a flexible working request unless you can show that it's absolutely not feasible. But what happened, like I said, the Employment Rights Bill was full of surprises, was that the 8 statutory reasons have remained. So actually, it hasn't been this wholesale change, which I think the unions were really keen to encompass, and what Labour suggested might happen. I think there's had to be some compromise, perhaps with organisations when they consulted on this. But you know, flexible working is already a day one, right? So that's already in place. That's what the Conservative government implemented. If you are going to refuse a request, then there are the grounds for saying, look, you know, we can't accommodate it because of one of the 8 statutory grounds. You've also got to kind of say why you think it's reasonable to refuse the application. So there's kind of that extra step where you've got to say it's reasonable. But you know, you guys would do that anyway. You wouldn't just say, computer says no, you know, you would generally say, I can't accommodate this request because of X, Y, and Z. So that's kind of your reasonableness, and you tick in the box with reasonableness there. And also, I think there's going to be a requirement for consultation before rejecting a request, but that's already included within the ACAS Code of Practice. So again, it's kind of having those conversations to say, look, we may not be able to accommodate this, but we may be able to accommodate that perhaps. But again, I think as good employers, you kind of would already have those conversations anyway. So there certainly hasn't been these wholesale changes, and there's no change in the penalty for a breach, which is 8 weeks pay. But what I would say is that because there was a lot of press about flexible working, we are seeing from all of our sector clients that people are asking more about flexible working. They're wanting that work-life balance. But it's hard in the education sector. You can't just let everyone work from home. Of course you can't. But I think it's worthwhile just having that conversation, I suppose, as senior leaders and within your organisation to think, well, look, are there any ways we can accommodate any kind of flexible working? Because that really, really does help from a recruitment and from a retention point of view, and also from a staff morale point of view as well, and embedding that really positive culture. So, I mean, it may be worthwhile thinking about different roles. You know, like I said, teachers, you know, it's difficult for them to work from home. They need to be in the classroom predominantly. But, you know, could certain support staff have some flexibility, perhaps? Is that something you could think about? Could teachers work from home if they've got some PPA time or subject leader days? You know, does everyone have a laptop? I know that can be quite a big expense for an organisation to give teachers laptops, but if they have got laptops, is it a case of you could say, look, do that work from home, and you know, and I think that would certainly be very welcome. Admin teams, do they need to be in the office, or could they have permanent working from home days? And also not necessarily flexible working, but you know, are you able to say to your staff, look, if you've got a child in a different school and it's their, you know, Christmas nativity or it's their sports day, can you accommodate them going to see their child do that? It may not be possible, but these are some of the things that we're talking to some of our education clients about, where they're wanting to think about, look, can we embed some kind of flexibility into our working? And I think it does come from, like I said, that the conversations that the Labour government had before the Employment Rights Bill was published was that they really wanted flexible working to be this default. And kind of following on, I suppose, from flexible working, Labour also pledged that, you know, they were going to bring in this right to switch off and work autonomously. And what we thought it might transpire as in the Employment Rights Bill was that actually, you know, employees may be able to say, well, look, you know, I've got my contracted hours. I can't be contacted outside of those hours, which, you know, caused a lot of concern for organisations and business leaders thinking, well, you know, we've got business needs. And there was also a concern as well, because, you know, people perhaps do want to work flexibly. A lot of people do want to work flexibly, but then you can't also have flexible working and a right to switch off. You can't say, do you know what, I'm going to start late because I want to do the school run, but actually my contract says I finish at 3:30. And at 3:31, you are not contacting me anymore. So it is a really, really fine balancing act. And I was going through the Employment Rights Bill, and you know, it's pretty lengthy. It's over 150 pages, and I was thinking, where is this right to switch off? Like, I can't find it. You know, I was thinking, I couldn't. It was going through all the clauses, thinking it's just not jumping out at me. And it wasn't in the Employment Rights Bill, which is why I couldn't see it. So it's not contained within legislation, which is what we thought it might be within the Employment Rights Bill. It's not. But what Labour have said is that in an accompanying document, that they're going to actually bring in this right to switch off via a code of practice. And what that means is that they're going to follow a model which is kind of already in place in Ireland. So in Ireland, they have this code of practice where they have a right to switch off. There are other countries that have the right to switch off, but they're much more they're more based in legislation, and they in Portugal particularly, if you don't comply with the right to switch off, then you can be fined up to €10,000. So it's really quite strict in Portugal. But the government seem to have kind of decided against that and gone with the Irish model. And what the Irish model kind of looks like is that they've produced this code of practice. And what they say is that, look, this is the best practice approach. And, you know, whilst there won't be any legal rights specifically, there can be reference made to these. You know, if somebody, for example, is working 24/7 and they have an accident at work, things like that, they probably will be taken into account. But it's very much a code of practice, and they produce these template communication clauses. But this is I'm just going to read from the template communication clause, which shows kind of how heavily caveated it is. And you'll see from the second paragraph on the bottom, it says, where a manager sends communication outside of agreed working hours, unless business and operational needs dictate that an immediate response is required, a statement will be attached to an out of hours email, tempering the expectation of an immediate response. So I think that's kind of how it's going to go, in that, look, if there is a pressing business need, then you can ask your employees to deal with an email, to respond to something that needs to be dealt with then and there. But the expectation is that you will try and not contact people outside of working hours. I think that's kind of how it's going to go. But there will be that caveat there. So I think, again, it's just kind of thinking about getting ahead of the curve here and thinking about your organisation. So thinking about, you know, how do your staff work at present? Do you know that some of them work excessively and they struggle to disconnect? They are always on, they're always responding to emails 24/7, because actually, from a health and safety point of view, from a well-being point of view, that's not great. And they're probably not working to the best of their abilities because they are constantly on go. So maybe start thinking about, can you have conversations with those people who are always online, always working, to think, look, can they take a step back? Can you think about disconnecting? Think about scenarios, because we are going to look at this code of practice, and there are going to be template policies that we'll need to utilise and amend for our education clients. So think about, are there times when you may need staff to work longer hours in different situations? So, for example, like a safeguarding issue that arises at 3 p.m, you know, you are going to have people working past their contracted hours. So kind of start thinking about that now. Thinking about work distribution, you know, is it spread out evenly? Or is it a case of some people have a higher workload and therefore need to work for longer? Also start having those conversations now. Have this open door policy where if somebody feels like they are working excessively, they can come and speak to you to say, look, you know, do I need to work more efficiently? How can I get through my work in the time that I'm given? And is there a case that it can be distributed more evenly, like I said? And WhatsApp groups, I think these are going to be quite tricky to manage, because a lot of organisations do have WhatsApp groups. They're really good for morale, and they're a good way for people to contact each other if they're running late in the mornings or they need to chat things through, etc. But of course, if the WhatsApp group, it's a work WhatsApp group, and it's pinging off all the way through the weekend, are people feeling that actually they perhaps need to take a step back from that WhatsApp group when it's not, when it's their own personal time? So I suppose it's thinking about, do you have work WhatsApp groups? Is it a case of a WhatsApp group could perhaps be muted over a weekend so people aren't feeling like they've constantly got to reply and constantly be on work mode when they're having some time to themselves? So just some things to consider there. So that was a quick canter through some of the things that we thought were most relevant to the education sector in the Employment Rights Bill. But of course, since the Employment Rights Bill has been published, we've also had the autumn budget. So I'm going to pass over to Ruth just to touch upon that now.
Thank you. So if we didn't have enough excitement already with the Employment Rights Bill, we also then had the budget. And obviously it was Rachel Reeves' first budget. And I think largely, I think everybody was wondering what was going to happen because there'd been a lot of play made about not taxing working people and that sort of thing. So I think it was quite interesting to see what's come out of it. And again, some of it is, again, a watching brief of things that we have been told or have heard and we haven't got some of the detail. That can't be said for national minimum wage rates, which we have now got the detail on those. So I think it's largely kind of what we were expecting because on the 5th of September, the Low Pay Commission, so the LPC, had published a policy paper explaining how it was expecting to tackle this updated remit that had been given by the government on the national living wage and the national minimum wage. And the remit was updated in July to encompass certain things that they'd set out as commitments in the plan to make work pay, along with some other things. And the government instructed the LPC to recommend an increased national living wage rate to apply from 2025. And that would, for the first time, take account the cost of living. There was also an agreement that the national minimum wage rate for 18 to 20-year-olds to apply from April should make an attempt to narrow the gap with the national living wage. So the idea was really a step towards what the government want to achieve, which is this aim of having a single adult rate. So I think, as it was kind of expected, it's the government's ambition to abolish it completely. It seems that they're going to take more of a slow process to that, on like a year by year basis. So the idea is that they're going to continue to further reduce the gap rather than take it away altogether in one go. So it looks like it's going to be done a little bit piecemeal, as Laura was saying with the legislation. That's what we think we're going to see, is bits of piecemeal things rather than just completely eliminating it. So I suppose if you've got anybody that is on these rates, and I appreciate won't necessarily be your teachers and probably not most of your support staff, but you probably, you might have some apprentices and things like that as well. It's important to understand what the rates are, what they're going to mean from April, and how you're going to get there. Now, calculating the national minimum wage rate, as you will probably know, is quite complex because it takes into account different parts of benefits, and certain things can be deducted and certain things can't. So it's really important to try and get that right. One of the things that's been considered in some businesses is because of affordability. They're looking at whether or not to consolidate some of the benefits into basic pay rather than providing the benefits separately. Again, that would require consultation. So if it is something you want to look at or you need to look at for those different areas, then it is something to be thinking about probably sooner rather than later. I think, you know, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because what we want is everybody to be paid a rate that they can actually live on, hence the national living wage. But of course, from our point of view, it starts to squeeze budgets and things which might already be tight. So it's about keeping an eye on it, having a look at what you're doing. If it does affect you, then obviously do let us know, and it is something, you know, we can look at and help with. If we can move on to the next slide. So also a rather big bone of contention. This came up on one of the sessions we had a week or two ago. And this is about the employers' national insurance contributions, which seemed to be the thing that came in to stop the working people paying tax. It seems to have come rather by the back door, I suppose, to employers. And the reason that we've touched on this is it's had quite a big impact, because I think people got wind of this just before the budget, and actually a lot of businesses started pausing hiring and taking less of their big decisions around staffing whilst they were waiting to see what the budget brought, which turns out to be quite a sensible move. Now, one of the key things here is, and obviously all the rates are there set out on the slide, it does affect all employers. Now, when we were talking about this at another event, that there does seem to be a suggestion that the public sector will be exempt. Now, as far as we can make out, and there's very little detailed information on this yet, but as far as we can make out, it's not an exemption per se. What is being said about schools, and I think it may be on the next slide, is that compensation will be given to cover the net effect of the national insurance changes. So the suggestion seems to be that the government will put more money into schools to cover the effect of those changes, rather than there be a simple exemption. Now, at the moment, we don't know what that's going to look like. I have Googled it this morning and discovered that actually there's not a lot more information out there as yet. So I would hope that the impact on schools and education shouldn't be significant. But that said, it's really difficult at the moment, because looking at what is being said as a result of the budget and what they're going to do for schools, there's lots of talk about money coming in from for different areas, particularly in relation to SEND. But some of the commentators are saying that actually they think that that will be impacted by deficits that are already in play, and particularly around local authorities. So it's difficult to know at this juncture how that's going to actually play out. But there are some reassurances being given that it should be funded to affect the net effect. That said, I know in education we'll probably be holding our breath a little bit, because we had this when we said, well, they're going to have pay rises and they wouldn't be fully funded. Then the pay rises, now the suggestion is they are being fully funded, but it's all that devil in the detail stuff, which, as Kat and Laura have both alluded to, we're getting these high line kind of messaging, and actually a lot of the detail isn't yet there to support for us to say to you, yes, this is absolutely the position. And just on that, I was going to ask Gemma actually to come in at this point, just to touch on what we reflected on around academies. And actually we've had a question in. So Gemma, if I just touch on this question and then bring you in, if that's all right. The question was about, what does the school support staff negotiating body mean for academy trusts? Well, again, we're still waiting for the devil in the detail, but looking at it, the intention is it will apply to academy trusts as well. Now, at the moment, academy trusts determine their own pay policies. And I know some academy trusts, obviously, because staff have TUPE'd over, do, you know, continue on the same pay scales, pay structures under STCPD, under the Burgundy Book. And this suggestion is that it's going to also apply to support staff, but it looks as though there might be a suggestion that the government might change it to mean that actually it will be affecting academies as well. But the reason I wanted to bring Gemma in is when we were on another session last week, we had our MAC Growth Roundtable and we had some really good discussion there. But one of the concerns was, while some money is getting put in to the system, certain monies are being taken out, and some of that money was around the funding for academies. Gemma, I just wondered if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that, because I think it's quite interesting for people on the call to see where that might go.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been sort of a bit of a blow really to we've had a chat about this, didn't we, Ruth? And we went into it quite in depth, but TCAF funding has come to an abrupt halt, and also the support grant that effectively you can apply to the DFE for to assist with your costs with regards to converting schools into the Academy Trust or bringing them in. This is going to have a huge impact, obviously, upon everybody, and we were sort of wondering why this has come about and what's going on, because as soon as I read it, you know, Ruth is the same, you know, we're both trustees in MATs, we're also governors at schools, and it's sort of like, well, how can this happen, and how can this come about? And I've had a lot of clients as well who are looking at creating MATs or are quite small and are still looking to bring schools in to grow the MAT, and they're saying, well, how can we possibly do that when all the funding's being taken away? And I completely understand that point, because I mean, to be honest, the maximum you could claim for support was 25k anyway, and even that didn't necessarily provide sufficient costs to be able to go through the process. So there's quite a lot been taken away. I do feel that there is going to have to be something that gives somewhere, and that something is going to have to come in, because, you know, we either see this as a bit of a halt to the creation of MATs, and sort of like looking at what we've got at the moment and trying to sort of steer schools towards already established MATs. But even then, we think that as well, it's putting pressure on the larger MATs, because it's saying to them now, well, you're not going to get the money, so you need to be funding that yourselves and looking at funding that yourselves. So that's looking at things like reserves and money that the MAT already has. So it's going to create definitely a change in how things are done. I can 100% see that. I do, however, feel that something's going to have to give, particularly with regards to the fact that there was such a short, I mean, they've always been talking about stopping that startup grant anyway, but with the release of the budget, it was sort of highlighted that if you don't get it in by the 2nd of December, you're not going to get it, and to get that application in, you have to have had approval to create the MAT or to bring the school in. So it's 100% going to have implications, Ruth, and also it is going to affect the financial side of things for existing trusts that are looking to bring schools in. Another client of mine as well had major concerns, because effectively they'd been told, right, well, you can bring this school into your MAT, but you've got to take that one as well because it's performing quite badly and we want you to deal with it. And they turned around and they said, well, okay, well, we'll do that, but we need funding and support for it. So they said, oh, well, you don't need to worry about that because you're going to get TCAF funding. No, they're not. Disappeared, gone. So as well, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations around that. So it's definitely a watch this space, and it's definitely going to have an impact, Ruth, 100%.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, and Gemma and I have heard from various sources talking about, you know, a drift back to local authority governance. We've heard, you know, the word federation being bandied about, which hasn't been bandied about for quite some time. So it'll be interesting to see what the stance of this government is going to be as to how schools are to collaborate and come together going forward. My own personal view, and it is only a personal view, is, you know, for it to go completely back to local authority governance would be really difficult because of the amounts of deficits in budgets and the
Mm.
streamlining of staff that's taken place over a long period of time. But it does look as though there needs to be something happening. And, you know, if we're going to go back to things like federations or just simply collaborative schools working, lots of people are already collaborating and working together anyway. But I think Gemma and I's concerns are largely around the sort of legal status of what that looks like, because of course when you're in academy, you might have however many schools you've got, the academy is the employer, the academy is the legal entity, and obviously if you've got a group of schools working together who just want to work together without any legal status, you've kind of got that issue about who actually has the last say. You know, where does the money come from? If you want to put the money together, how does that work? So whilst it can work, absolutely, and of course, you know, at Forbes we're going to be open to whatever models this takes shape in, but we want to be in the sector with you, kind of looking at how this works going forward. So a lot of this feels at the moment like a watch and wait sort of approach, and as Laura really skillfully weaved into her session, of course that's what the education Q&As are all about, for us to try and be there with you, sort of looking at what's on the horizon. So we have had another question, so thanks Gemma for that. Kat, I'm going to come to you because it's about the right to work, so sorry, the right to switch off. The question is about existing contracts and the entitlement that employers may feel in relation to contacting their members of staff outside of working hours. Do you want to touch on that for us?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, as employers, you generally don't want to be contacting staff outside of working hours. You know, you generally would hope that you can get the work done, you know, during the contracted hours, and you're not routinely asking people to work and burn the midnight oils. But the concern that employers were having when Labour was saying, look, we're going to bring in this right to switch off, was that if there was this wholesale, you cannot contact an employer after their contracted hours, there are going to be exceptions to the rules where you do need people, you do need to be able to contact them, you know, if you've got a big meeting the next day and you need to find a document, you can't find it. If you send an email, then an employer may respond, or you may need to call them to say, look, I just can't find it. And you normally would have that goodwill with your employees where they will be happily say, oh yeah, that's fine, that's a 5-minute job, I'll just jump on my computer and send it to you. So that's kind of how it works. And sometimes, I mean, in a lot of contracts, it does say these are your contracted hours, but there may be some flexibility in that, or we may need to contact you outside the hours. Or, you know, it may work the other way where, you know, there may be flexibility from your point of view. But I think the concern was that if there was going to be this wholesale, you cannot contact outside of the contracted hours, what would happen in those scenarios where you're all prepping for something, you need to get it done. How would that work? So I think, you know, as it works as an employee at present, you don't really want to be contacting people 24/7, but it was just those exceptional situations, which I think the way it's going to go is that the code of practice will kind of say, look, if there's an urgent business need, then of course it would be sensible for you to be able to contact an employee if necessary.
Thanks, Kat. I think you know, looking at the budget and different things, you know, there's also a lot of talk about the SEN funding and where that's going to sit. And I know at the moment there's a real crisis around SEN in schools and not having the funding, not having the support, not being able to get that support. And I think, you know, again, commentators seem to be suggesting that the difficulty is because there are so many deficits, whether that money will actually make a difference in real terms, or whether it's actually just going to plug gaps that we've already got. And you know, I think looking at it, there still seems to be a lot out there that could happen, but we just at the moment don't have any of the finer detail on it. I don't know whether Sam wants to add anything, but I was just reading this morning about a suggestion as well that there's going to be some money for investing in fixing school and college buildings to help with the rebuilding programme. Sam, I don't know whether that's something you've seen and you want to talk about, but I certainly think, you know, I'm sure that would be quite welcome, particularly after we've recently had all the difficulties with school buildings, and you know, we've had to go through all the RAC situation not that long ago. I think that would probably be a very welcome amount of money, but again, it's about where it's going to go. I don't know, Sam, if you wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, it's something that we've read a little bit about. So for schools, I think the government's committed an additional 1.4 billion to making sure that the school rebuilding programme can continue, which would hopefully mean upwards of 100 rebuilding projects starting next year. I think the aim is to keep the government on track for rebuilding 518 schools in total. And on top of that, there's a further 2.1 billion that's being allocated to maintain and improve school buildings, which is an increase of 300 million compared to last year. There's also funding being made available to colleges as well, in relation to the further education estate, in the region of about 300 million. So hopefully that will bring about plans for improvements to facilities, which can offer some certainty to colleges and further education establishments. I think it's something that we'll continue to keep an eye on in terms of news around that, and possibly something that we can update on in the next Q&A.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. And I think, you know, it's really important to say, you know, if anybody has got any other questions, please do put them on. We know we've blinded you with a lot of information this morning, but what we wanted to try and do was get some information out there, get some thought processes going. Obviously, you know, if you need to talk about stuff offline, obviously we're always here to do that. We're happy to get involved and chat with you about what you've got on. And it'd be remiss of me not to say that Sam and the talented team and the property team will obviously be able to help you in the event you do have a rebuilding project. But again, I think it's about seeing how that money is going to land, who it's going to sit with, and what actually is it going to be there to fix. So these all seem to be very big headlines at the moment. We will obviously be keeping a watching brief on it as well. But I suppose just to throw it out there, whether there are any more questions, we've had a couple this morning, but we appreciate there's a lot of information there. We will, I think, be able to send the slides out to just give you some of the headlines. And if you do have any other questions and want to get in touch, please feel free to do so. Just having a look here, another question's come in. Interesting, the Audit Commission recognised the spend should be 6 billion each year and it was only 2 billion, and that didn't address CO2 reduction. Schools represent less than 30% of all government CO2 emissions. Yeah, again, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because, you know, we need more money, we need more investment to support our schools. We can always, I think, in schools use more money, you know, try and deliver the objectives for the children. And sometimes it just doesn't feel enough. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it's more than a drop in the ocean. But I think it's good to know that this stuff is out there. I think if everybody keeps a watching brief on it, we will obviously report back if we see anything that we think will be of use. But we're coming now to the end of our session this morning. So I just want to thank all of my esteemed colleagues for a really good session this morning. Thank you all for attending and regularly attending. It makes these sessions worthwhile for us. And if anybody does have any questions or need to get in touch, please do feel free to contact any of us. We'll be more than willing to help if we can. So all that remains to say is next session is the 10th of December. That'll be the last one before Christmas. It's coming round fast. And just want to say thank you to everybody for attending this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.